My name is Noah. It has been 3 years. 3 long, heavy years, though to me they feel like a lifetime folded and compressed into memory when I pause to think about it. It almost feels like I lived 2 separate lives, the one that came before, where my days were marked by suffocating tension and constant second guessing, and the one that began when I stepped into basic military training. That day wasn't just about joining the military. It was about closing a door that had been open for too long, shutting out the person who had held so much power over me for most of my life. When I entered training, I dropped my mother completely from my life. It was not a rash act done in a moment of temper. It was not a decision I later doubted or wondered if I had been too harsh. It was deliberate, final, clean. I had thought about it long before the moment came, turning it over in my mind during sleepless nights, imagining what it might feel like to finally breathe without her shadow hanging over me. And when the chance came, I simply did it. I blocked her number, I gave the military clerks different next of kin contacts, and I never looked back. At the time I was 22. Like every young man in my country, I was required to serve. Mandatory conscription is part of our system. But unlike many of my peers, I went beyond the requirement. I signed a contract that made me a professional soldier, a regular serviceman in the Air Force. To some, that might sound like ambition or patriotism. To me, it was survival. The military wasn't only a duty, it was my lifeline, my one reliable escape from a life that had felt unbearable. The strange, ordered chaos of military life was almost soothing. Marching in formation, following commands, living by the clock. These were things that might feel oppressive to others, but to me they were a relief. They were predictable. They were fair. They did not change because of someone's mood. In uniform, I was just another soldier, not a target for unpredictable anger or manipulation. That sense of structure was something my childhood never gave me. My siblings understood instantly. My older sister had already left years earlier on a scholarship overseas, and my brother had found work on the other side of the world. I was the last one left at home. When I told them about my decision to go beyond conscription and make the military my life, they didn't question me, didn't try to convince me otherwise. They had lived through the same household. They had endured the same undercurrent of fear and pressure, the same subtle humiliations that chipped away at your spirit until you doubted yourself in everything. Each of them had found a way out. Now it was my turn. People sometimes misunderstand when I talk about my upbringing. They think words like abuse or domestic tyranny are exaggerated. They imagine broken bones or shouting matches heard down the street. But abuse doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it coils around you so quietly that you only notice the damage years later, when you realize how much of yourself has been eroded away. My mother's control wasn't about dramatic explosions. It was about slow corrosion. It was about affection given only when convenient, about rules that changed without notice, about the feeling that no matter what you did, it was never quite enough. In our house, it was as if we were all actors in a play we hadn't agreed to join. My mother was the director, the writer, the one who changed the script at will. One moment she could praise you, and in the very next, the same act could become a source of scorn. Living like that leaves you hollow, always waiting for the shift, always unsure whether what you're experiencing is real. But before her power fully settled on us children, before I truly grasped how destructive she could be, there was my father. He was the first one she broke. My father died when I was 14, and the way it happened is carved into me so deeply that I will never forget. He was in a car accident, sudden, brutal. I remember exactly where I was when the news came. It was an ordinary day in history class, the teacher lecturing about ancient empires, when the classroom door opened. Another teacher stepped in, a woman known for her kindness, the sort of teacher every student trusted. The look on her face told me everything before she even spoke. Her eyes were heavy with sorrow, but behind them was a quiet urgency, the kind of panic someone tries to suppress for the sake of a child. She murmured something to my teacher, and then I was told to pack my things. No one said the words, but I knew. Children are perceptive that way. I could feel the weight of tragedy pressing down before I even left the room. The teacher who had come for me didn't let me take the bus. She drove me herself. That drive is still vivid in my memory, the hum of the car, the blur of the city passing by, people walking casually, drivers honking, a group of students laughing at a bus stop. Life looked so painfully normal, and yet I was being pulled into something irrevocably different. My heart pounded so hard it drowned out every sound. The silence between us in the car was unbearable, yet filled with unspoken truth. At the hospital, the first thing that struck me was the smell. That sharp, antiseptic scent mixed with something else. Later I would learn to recognize it as the sterile grief of hospitals, that strange quiet that clings to places where people come to die. The hallway seemed unnaturally silent except for the hum of machines in distant rooms. When I reached the ward, I found my siblings already there, pale and shaken. My mother stood with them, her face tight, unreadable. My uncle, my father's younger brother, was there too, his expression carved from sorrow but steady, his hand on my sister's shoulder as if to anchor her in place. And then I saw my father. He lay surrounded by machines, wires running across his body like vines, tubes connecting him to life support. The steady beeping of monitors filled the air, mechanical reminders that his life was slipping away. It felt surreal, as though I had stepped into a movie where none of the rules of reality applied. This man, my father, my protector, the one who had carried me on his shoulders and stayed up late to help with school projects, now looked small, fragile, almost unrecognizable. I forced my legs to move, each step heavy as if weighted with stone. My siblings made room for me at his bedside. I reached for his hand, terrified of what I would feel. It was cold, fragile, nothing like the strong, steady hands I remembered. But there was still something familiar there. The slight callus on his thumb from years of holding a pen, a small but intimate detail that told me this was still him. And then, impossibly, I felt it, a squeeze. Faint, barely there, so delicate I almost believed I had imagined it. But it was real. He squeezed my hand, one final act of love, one final acknowledgement of me, his son. Moments later, everything shattered. The machines erupted in alarm, their steady rhythm turning into a frantic chorus. Doctors and nurses rushed in, their movements a desperate ballad of precision. I stood frozen, my heart caught between hope and dread. They worked on him with urgency, their voices sharp, their hands moving with trained efficiency. For a few terrible minutes, I convinced myself they could bring him back, but the doctor's face told me before his words did. The fight was over. My father was gone. A sheet was pulled over his face, and with that simple gesture, the world shifted. My life, already fragile, broken away I would never fully repair. The room fell into silence. My siblings cried quietly. My uncle stood still, his jaw tight, and then my mother spoke. Her words cut through the heavy air and lodged like ice in my stomach. She said she didn't want a funeral. It was so sudden, so cold, that at first I thought I had misheard. But she repeated it calmly, almost casually. My uncle stared at her, bewildered. He asked if it was about money and quickly offered to pay all expenses. He wanted his brother to have a proper farewell, to be remembered with dignity. My mother shook her head. She said she didn't want the hassle, didn't want to deal with visitors and their so-called insincere condolences. She dismissed the idea of a funeral as if it were nothing more than an inconvenience. The argument that followed was quiet but intense. My uncle's voice trembled with anger as he pressed her, but in the end she had the legal authority. As his wife, she had the final say. And so my father was cremated the very next morning, a rushed process that felt like an erasure. The speed of it all was shocking. There was no time to gather extended family, no time to grieve properly, no moment to reflect on the life he had lived. It felt as if she wanted him erased, as if his existence were something to sweep away quickly before anyone could linger. To us, it felt like she had been waiting for him to disappear. And then, almost as quickly as the grief appeared, I saw her move on. One day she wept in front of others, and the next she was cold, practical, detached. It was as if she had flipped a switch, deciding sorrow was no longer convenient. Watching her, I realized something that chilled me. I should not have been surprised, because long before that hospital night, I had already seen how she treated my father. Her coldness after my father's death should not have surprised me, but still, it did. The speed with which she put away her grief, or at least the performance of it, was unsettling. One day she was the grieving widow, tears on her cheeks, speaking softly about how unfair life could be. The very next day she was brisk, practical, and seemingly unbothered. It was as if sorrow was something she could pick up and put down at will, like a coat she no longer needed to wear. The truth was that I had already seen how she treated him for years. My father had been a gentleman, quiet and thoughtful, but he was not weak. At least, not in the way she wanted us to believe. I was too young to witness the earliest years of their marriage, But my sister told me stories later, stories that made my stomach knot. She described the day she came home from school at 15 and found our mother, red-faced with fury, slapping our father again and again. Not once, not twice, 12 times in a row, as if she needed to make the violence itself into some twisted ritual. The reason? She had caught him looking at adult content online. In her eyes, that wasn't just a mistake or a lapse in judgment. It was adultery. She accused him of sullying their marriage, of betraying her in a way she could never forgive. She stormed out of the house that evening, but not before setting conditions for her return. Humiliating conditions. He had to install monitoring software on his phone, surrender his personal computer, and agree to so-called healing sessions at our church. He complied, because what choice did he have? We grew up in a charismatic megachurch. To outsiders, it looked vibrant, alive, filled with song and energy. To us, it was a breeding ground for fear. The sermons often gave my mother ammunition for her behavior. She twisted their teachings into weapons, using the language of faith to justify control. She told my father that his salvation depended on her forgiveness, that without her grace he was nothing but a sinner doomed to failure. She was judge, jury, and executioner, all under the banner of religion. Years later, my sister asked my father about that time. By then he was honest, painfully so. He told her their marriage had been struggling, that intimacy had been withheld, and that he had felt unbearably alone. He turned to adult content, not because he wanted to betray her, but because he was starving for affection. He told my sister that he felt like a failure as a husband, like a fraud as a man. He even warned her not to choose a partner like him, as though his flaws defined him entirely. My sister was angry, not at what he had done, but at how deeply he despised himself. They cried together, and she told me later that moment changed how she saw both of our parents. She saw his brokenness, but also the cruelty in how our mother wielded it against him. Her treatment of him became a pattern. Every disagreement circled back to that one accusation. "You ruined the marriage," she would say. "You failed in your role as head of the family." Those words became weapons used to silence him, to keep him in his place. And yet, in front of us, she would sometimes praise him. She would smile and say what a good father he was, what a steady man. The whiplash was unbearable. We never knew which version of her we would get. Dinner could begin with laughter and end in icy silence because of a single stray word. My mother worked, and she earned more than my father. I think she never forgave him for that imbalance. She carried her work home like a shield, snapping at us if we tried to ask for attention. Her office became a fortress, a space where we were not welcome. My father tried to protect us, sometimes raising his voice in frustration, but I understand now that he was doing his best to shield us from her moods. Her distance was constant. Even on family trips, she spent more time on her phone than speaking to us. In the car, she was glued to podcasts or messaging. At home, she claimed exhaustion and locked herself away for 3 or 4 hour naps. It wasn't rest, it was avoidance. An excuse to not be present, to not be accountable. So my father picked up the slack. He cooked, he cleaned, he did laundry, even when he was sick. My sister used to scold him for it, angry that he allowed himself to be treated like a servant. He only shrugged, saying, "Someone has to." And when he grew too tired, she would join him in the chores. They carried the weight together silently. Then there was the piano. My mother was a musician, skilled at the harp, and she insisted we all learn piano. She called it passing down her gift, but to us it felt like punishment. My father joked sometimes, saying the only instrument he could play was the triangle. He tried to lighten the mood, but it was no joke for us. Piano practice became synonymous with dread. The sound of the metronome was enough to make my stomach clench. Tick-tock, tick-tock, each beat a countdown to scolding or worse. My mother's temper flared quickly, and her punishments were sharp. Raps across the knuckles with a ruler left stinging pain that lingered long after practice ended. I struggled the most, restless and easily distracted. Reading music was hard for me, and she had no patience for it. What should have been music became torment. My father tried, in his gentle way, to soften it. He would play a silly tune with one finger, humming along, trying to make me laugh. Sometimes he encouraged us to practice quietly when she wasn't home, hoping we would do well enough to avoid her wrath. But on weekends she demanded performances, and anxiety would coil in my stomach like a snake. She rarely used physical punishment, but her other methods cut deeper. Silent treatment, emotional blackmail, lectures that could drag on for an hour. She would sit us down and dismantle us with words. Every flaw, every failing, every reason we were disappointments. Her voice didn't even need to rise. It was steady, cold, relentless. That kind of punishment left scars no one could see. Later, I learned from my aunt that my grandmother had been the same. My mother had grown up locked out of the house for disobedience, subjected to the same emotional cruelty she later passed on to us. Abuse, it seemed, was a legacy. And while my father sometimes tried to intervene, she would simply throw him out of the room, dismissing him as irrelevant. After his death, everything grew worse. My mother tightened her grip. She criticized my sister for her clothes, for her friends, for every choice she made. But my sister was clever. She didn't rebel outright. She kept her head down, studied hard, and seized the first opportunity to leave. A scholarship to the U.S. was her salvation, and she took it. She hasn't been back since. My brother, the middle child, found his escape in work overseas on an oil rig in Australia. He only comes home for our grandparents, never for her. That left me, and with me, her cruelty shifted shape again. By the time I reached 13, I had already started carrying the weight of anger I didn't fully understand. Adolescence is hard for anyone, but in a household like ours, it felt like trying to grow up in quicksand. Every step forward was met with some invisible pull dragging me down. I wanted freedom, independence, respect. What I got was constant correction, constant reminders that I was not enough. That year, I made one of my greatest mistakes. I skipped class, thinking I was clever enough to get away with it. I wasn't. I was caught, and the school called home, by some stroke of luck, or maybe mercy. They called my father instead of my mother. He was a history teacher at another school, and when he arrived, he looked mortified. I could see the shame etched on his face as he apologized to my teachers, bowing his head, his voice thick with regret. The walk back to his car felt endless. His hand rested on my shoulder, not heavy, but firm. I remember the heat rising in my cheeks, the weight of my own foolishness pressing down. In the car, he spoke quietly, not in anger, but in deep disappointment. His words were measured, but they carried more weight than shouting ever could. He told me how lucky I was that it wasn't my mother who had been called. He said it so plainly, as if it were an undeniable fact, something carved into the very rules of our family life. And I snapped. All the resentment that had been building in me erupted. I accused him of weakness, of spendlessness. I hurled words I didn't truly mean, but couldn't stop myself from saying. I told him he had let her tyrannize our family, that if he had even a shred of self-respect, he would have left her years ago. I wanted to hurt him because I was hurting. I wanted to make him feel the shame I felt, the frustration I had carried like a stone in my chest. The effect was immediate. He didn't yell. He didn't even argue. He simply deflated. The air seemed to drain out of him. His shoulders slumped, his grip on the wheel loosened, and his face fell into an expression I can never forget. Deep sorrow, quiet and personal. He asked, in a voice so faint I almost missed it, if that was truly what I thought of him. I couldn't answer. Pride held my tongue, though my heart screamed that I was wrong. He shook his head slowly, eyes fixed on the road, and whispered, "Let's go home." That silence followed me like a shadow. It was heavier than any punishment my mother had ever given. I knew I had wounded him in a way that words could not repair. And the cruelest part, I never got the chance to apologize. He died a year later, and that moment became a wound that has never fully closed. For years, I wondered if he was weak. At 13, it was easy to believe it. Easy to look at his quiet endurance and confuse it with spendlessness. But life is never that simple. When I was 21, a week before enlisting, my Uncle C invited me to dinner. We sat across from each other in a modest restaurant, the kind with warm lights and simple food, and he finally gave me the answer I had never dared to ask. He explained why my father stayed. The custody laws in our country, he said, were a cruel joke. If my father had left, he would have lost us automatically. 3 children gone, and on top of that, he would have been forced to pay child support to a woman who already earned more than he did. It would have destroyed him financially, leaving him unable to even provide for himself, let alone for us. So he stayed, not because he was weak, not because he lacked courage, but because he loved us with a depth I had been too young to see. He chose to absorb her moods, her cruelty, her scorn, because at least that way he could shield us from the worst of it. He was our buffer, our silent guardian. Without him, the household would have been unbearable. With him, at least, there was laughter sometimes. There were small moments of peace. He endured misery so that our lives could have even fragments of happiness. When my uncle told me this, I broke down. I cried so hard I could barely breathe. All those years of confusion, all the bitterness I had held against him, suddenly collapsed under the truth. He wasn't weak. He was selfless. He had carried a burden that should never have been his alone, and he did it out of love for his children. Then my uncle told me something that shook me even more. He said he once asked my father when the last truly happy moment in his marriage had been. My father had answered without hesitation the day I was born. My birth was the final memory of pure joy he carried with my mother. Everything afterward had been tainted by struggle, but that one moment, holding me as a newborn, was something he cherished so much that it outweighed years of pain. Those words were like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. All my life I had wondered if I was a mistake, if my existence was a burden. Hearing that I had once been the source of his purest joy gave me something I had never dared to claim before, a sense of worth. Then came the letters. My uncle handed me a stack, neatly bundled, my father's handwriting covering the envelopes. He had written them for us, 3 sets of each, one for every child. Inside were stories, memories, fragments of his life that he wanted us to carry forward. He wrote about his days in the military, about his college years, about the nights he stayed up caring for us when we were sick. Reading them was like hearing his voice again, like having him back for just a little while. I spent the entire night poring over them, tears blurring the ink, my heart breaking and healing at the same time. But my relief was short-lived. The next day, foolishly, I left the letters on my study table. When I came home from meeting a teacher, they were gone. I didn't have to ask who had taken them. The silence in the house told me everything. My mother had found them. I searched her room when she was in the shower, driven by desperation, and there in the shredder bin I saw the remains. Torn fragments of colored paper, familiar handwriting shredded into unrecognizable strips. She hadn't just hidden them, she had destroyed them. Every single one. It was deliberate, calculated, cruel. Not just a whim of anger, but a final act of control. She wanted his voice erased. She wanted his memory silenced, even from beyond the grave. It was jealousy, pure and bitter. Jealousy of a love she could never command, a love he gave to us freely. I didn't confront her. What would have been the point? Any fight would have turned into another one of her lectures, another twisting of blame until somehow it was my father's fault, or mine, or anyone's but hers. I swallowed my rage, but inside me, something hardened. I knew then that I could never stay. A week later, I enlisted. By then, my decision was unshakable. I wasn't only enlisting for duty. I was enlisting for survival, for freedom, for a chance to breathe air that wasn't poisoned by her control. When the day came, my mother wasn't there. She claimed she had a work seminar to attend, as though my departure was no more significant than a routine errand. Her absence was not a wound. It was a relief. It confirmed what I had always suspected, that her attachment to me was conditional, transactional, and shallow. She only said, with a faint smile that carried no warmth, that she looked forward to seeing me when I finished training. I nodded, but inside I had already closed that door forever. When I boarded the bus, the air felt lighter. The road stretched ahead, and for the first time in my life, it felt like it was mine. I blocked her number on my phone before the bus even pulled out of the station. It was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of survival. I had to cut the cord before it strangled me completely. At registration, when the clerks asked me to list my next of kin, I didn't hesitate. I gave them my uncle's name and my grandparents. Those were the people who had truly cared for me, who had stepped in when my father could not. My mother's name didn't even cross my lips. In the weeks that followed, the routines of military life filled every hour. Wake at dawn drills, training, meals, more drills. Exhaustion so deep that sleep came instantly. To some, it was grueling. To me, it was healing. Every command followed, every march completed, every uniform neatly pressed was a reminder that life could be lived with structure instead of chaos. No hidden rules. No shifting moods. Just clear expectations and fair consequences. My platoon sergeant noticed I never made calls during free time. Once, he asked me why. I told him simply that my family wasn't together anymore. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. He studied me for a long moment, then gave a firm nod and patted me on the back. That gesture meant more to me than any words. It was quiet acknowledgement, respect without intrusion. And so the days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. The noise of my childhood still echoed inside me. The criticisms, the manipulations, the constant tension. But gradually, it began to fade. In its place grew something else, a strength, identity, peace. I began to see myself not as the boy who had been diminished, but as the man my father had quietly hoped I would become. Because in the end, my father was not weak. That word had haunted me for years. But I finally understood the truth. Weakness is surrendering to selfishness. Weakness is abandoning your children because you crave your own comfort. My father did neither. He endured. He sacrificed his own happiness so that his children could have fragments of safety, fragments of peace. He carried a burden no one should ever have to carry. And he did it out of love. That is not weakness. That is strength. Now, as I serve in the Air Force, I build a life on my own terms. My choice is my path, my future. I carry my father's memory with me, not as a chain, but as a compass. He showed me what it meant to love selflessly, even when it cost everything. My mother no longer defines me. Her voice, once so loud in my head, has grown faint. The turmoil she planted is still there, but it no longer rules me. I honor my father by living in freedom, by refusing to let her shadow shape the rest of my life. This is my peace. Hard won, fragile but real.